Some stories crawl out of the grave. Others are buried beneath ice and silence. From the bone-dry heart of the Australian outback to the snow-blind trails of Siberia, terror doesn't knock. It waits. Here, we tell the tales that stay with you long after the fire's gone out. Zombies, vanished hikers, unsolved deaths, end-of-the-world whispers that echo through time. This is Aussie After Dark, the place where the line between fact and fear disappears. So light a candle, lock the doors, and don't blink, because the story you're about to hear might just be true. And if you can take a second to subscribe, it really motivates and helps to continue these stories. Also in the comments below, let me know where you're from, and we might just pop up there. Flora Valley Station Mystery, December 1986. Chapter 1. Who were James and Simon? Before the dust and silence swallowed their story, before the headlines, the courtrooms, and the coroner's verdict, there were just two boys. James Annetts was 16 years old. He came from Griffith, a rural town in New South Wales. A wiry, soft-spoken teenager with a quick smile and a shy confidence, James had grown up in a devout Christian family, the youngest of 6 siblings. He was bright, respectful, and hard-working, a boy who loved cricket, his family, and who looked up to his father, Vincent, a church elder and high school principal. He had never been far from home, never lived on his own, and had never been exposed to the brutal solitude of the desert. In early 1986, James saw a newspaper ad placed by a Northern Territory pastoral company, Baines River Cattle Company. It offered outback adventure and work as a jackaroo, an Australian term for a young, untrained stockman on a cattle station. It sounded like the promise of manhood, and with his parents' blessing, he took the job. What he couldn't have known was that the ad was misleading. What sounded like teamwork and adventure turned out to be something else entirely. Within days of arriving at Flora Valley Station, James was assigned to a distant outstation with no running water, no phone, no supervision, and no company. His only link to the outside world was a Coden HF radio used for short daily check-ins with the homestead. Even so, James kept his concerns mostly to himself. But something about his arrival unsettled those who saw him. A Kukacha elder from the nearby Yaga Yaga community remembered the moment years later, saying, "They were just kids. They looked nervous, kept looking back. We knew something was wrong the moment they came through." Simon Amos was 17. He came from the Adelaide Hills in South Australia, a little older than James, but no more prepared for what lay ahead. Described by friends as intelligent, creative, and a bit of a dreamer, Simon was at a crossroads in his life. He had struggled with school and was looking for direction, a job, perhaps even a sense of adventure or purpose. Like James, he answered the Baines River ad and was soon on a plane north. Simon arrived at Flora Valley Station just weeks before James, but he was almost immediately posted to Sturt Creek Outstation, more than 100 kilometers from the main homestead. The property was remote, harsh, and virtually abandoned. By the time James arrived, Simon had already experienced the crushing isolation of outstation life. Long days of routine tasks, like pumping water, checking bores, and maintaining fences, all in 45-degree heat, alone. Supplies were dropped off once every 2 weeks. Communication was sparse, and their youth, inexperience, and vulnerability made them easy to overlook and easier to forget. The 2 boys had been at Flora Valley for only 7 weeks when they vanished. There were no supervisors with them, no backup, no regular welfare checks. They were hundreds of kilometers from the nearest police station, cell tower, or sealed road. And despite their young age, Both had been assigned to completely isolated posts, alone in the desert, with only a radio and a few gallons of fuel. In those last days of November 1986, James and Simon set out on what should have been a routine circuit. They drove together in a Datsun Ute, planning to visit Simon's outstation at Sturt Creek, then continue to Nicholson Outstation, where James had been stationed. The sun was merciless. The roads were endless. But something went wrong. Neither boy ever checked in again. When the search began, 3 days too late, one thing became terrifyingly clear. These weren't seasoned station hands. They weren't experienced bushmen. They were just kids, left alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, and someone had failed them. Chapter 2. Signs of Trouble. By the final week of November 1986, something was unraveling at Flora Valley Station. The summer heat was rising above 45 degrees Celsius by midday. Red dust hung in the air like smoke, and beneath the daily grind of outstation life, tensions were boiling over, quietly, dangerously. James Annetts and Simon Amos were both in trouble. Though they were young and inexperienced, they weren't alone in noticing that something felt off at Flora Valley. Christopher Rumpf, a fellow jackaroo, and one of the few other young men on the property, would later testify to a string of hostile encounters between the boys and their boss, station manager Giles Loader. Rumpf recalled raging arguments between Simon and Loader, shouting matches that echoed across the open bushland. Simon had grown frustrated with the isolation and the lack of guidance, and Loader's response, Rumpf claimed, was not support, but intimidation. James, too, found himself on the wrong side of Loader's temper. In one instance, after a minor incident involving a station vehicle, Loader allegedly threw a spanner at James in a fit of rage. The tool missed, but the message didn't. This wasn't mentorship. It wasn't even management. It was control, enforced by fear. And it was coming from the one man responsible for their well-being. Despite the growing tension, the boys carried on. They followed orders. They checked in daily on the Coden HF radio, until they didn't. On December 1st, 1986, they were scheduled for a routine check-in. The crackle of the HF radio should have brought their voices in from the desert, but nothing came. At first, the silence might have been written off as a technical glitch, common in the outback. But when the boys missed a second check-in on December 2nd, unease began to spread among a few of the other jackaroos. They raised their concerns to Loader. He did nothing. 3 full days passed before Giles Loader reported the boys missing to police. By then, the trail had already gone cold. Temperatures had reached dangerous highs, and any chance of finding them quickly, alive, had likely already slipped away. Why the delay? Why didn't the station manager act immediately when they failed to call in? It's a question the families, and many others, have asked for decades. A question that still doesn't have a clear answer. But the most disturbing sign of trouble came from the people who lived closest to the land. In the days after the boys' disappearance, several indigenous residents from the nearby Yaga Yaga community came forward. They told police that they had seen the boys pass through town, driving slowly, nervously, in their Datsun Ute. But they also said something else, something far more chilling. A 4-wheel drive, they claimed, had been following James and Simon, just minutes behind them as they headed south out of the community, away from their outstations and deeper into the desert. The implication was immediate. Were the boys being followed, tracked, coerced? But when locals reported this to authorities, they were ignored. No follow-up interviews, no sketches or statements were taken. The tip was dismissed. Whether it was cultural bias, bureaucratic failure, or something more sinister, no one knows for sure. But what is certain is this: that eyewitness report, potentially the last confirmed sighting of James and Simon alive, was never pursued. And so, within just a few days, every safeguard had failed. 2 boys, already at the edge of their endurance, were emotionally fraying, mismanaged, and increasingly isolated. They were sent alone into one of the most hostile environments in Australia, with a manager who had reportedly abused them, a vehicle with limited range, and no backup. When they vanished, no alarm was raised until it was too late. And when people came forward, people who had seen things, no one listened. Some believed that by the time the search began, the desert had already made its decision. But others still wonder if someone else made it first. Chapter 3. The Search. When Giles Loader finally contacted authorities on December 3, 1986, the boys had already been missing for nearly 3 full days. In the scorching Kimberley heat, that kind of delay can be fatal. And yet, the urgency didn't seem to match the moment. The police response was limited, under-resourced, and slow. A small contingent was dispatched from Halls Creek, the nearest town, but they lacked critical support. No immediate aircraft, no heat-sensing equipment, no trained bush trackers. Worse still, the local knowledge of indigenous residents and station jackaroos was largely ignored. Station hands like Christopher Rumpf, who had worked the terrain, offered to help. But according to multiple sources, they were told to stand down. "We could have searched that country in a day," Rumpf later recalled. "We knew where they might go, but they didn't want us involved." Instead, the search was largely directed by the very man whose decisions had already put the boys at risk, Giles Loader. He insisted the boys would have taken a specific route, a narrow track toward Nicholson Outstation. That's where authorities focused their early efforts. But there was a problem. That track wasn't the one James and Simon were last seen on. Indigenous witnesses at Yaga Yaga had watched the Datsun Ute heading south, not east, toward the edge of the desert, not toward their assigned posts. That direction, the direction where their bodies would later be found, was ignored in the first week of searching. The weather was punishing. In the Kimberley, December is the start of the wet season. Torrential heat, rising humidity, and no relief in sight. For a brief moment, police used a light aircraft to sweep a wide area. But the search was superficial. And by December 6th, just 3 days after reporting the boys missing, authorities began scaling back operations. One officer reportedly told locals, "They've probably just run away." It was a stunning dismissal. These weren't bush-hardened escapees. They were 2 teenage boys, both deeply religious, both with families who trusted the station to look after them. And as it turned out, they hadn't run away at all. Back in New South Wales and South Australia, the Annetts and Amos families were only just learning of the disappearance. Vincent Annetts, James's father, was devastated and angry. He flew to the Kimberley immediately, joining the search and pleading with authorities to expand the area. He begged them to listen to the local indigenous trackers, to consult the people who truly knew the land. Still, those offers of help went largely unanswered. By mid-December, an aircraft from the WA Police Air Wing was brought in to widen the aerial search. But by then, the boys had been missing for more than 2 weeks. Any water they had would have long since run dry. Any shelter would have offered little defense against the elements. And the vastness of the great sandy desert had swallowed them whole. In the end, it was not the official search that found them. 4 months later, in April 1987, a surveying team, completely unrelated to the investigation, was flying over the remote desert, 18 kilometers from where the boys' vehicle had been abandoned, when they noticed something unusual on the ground. Scattered bones, bleached by the sun. Simon was found first, his skull weathered and exposed, with the remains of a .22 rifle nearby. James's body was located 2 kilometers further, curled near a dry creek bed beneath a small desert shrub. His watch was still ticking. Both had been dead for months. The outback had hidden them. But it was the inaction, the delays, and the dismissed warnings that had truly left them behind. To this day, the early search efforts remain one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the case. Why were local volunteers turned away? Why was the last known direction of travel, south, not east, ignored? Why was the search scaled down after only a few days, despite extreme heat, minimal water, and the boys' youth? And finally, did those critical first 72 hours seal their fate? Because out there, in the desert, every hour matters. And for James and Simon, help came far too late. Chapter 4. The Discovery. The desert gave nothing, until it did. 4 months after James Annetz and Simon Amos vanished from the fringes of Flora Valley Station, the land finally loosened its grip. It was April 23rd, 1987. A surveying team working with a mining exploration company was flying over a desolate stretch of desert, roughly 18 kilometers south of where the boys' vehicle had been found abandoned. Below them, in the red dust and scrub, something pale and unnatural caught their eye. They circled back. What they saw was unmistakable: a human skull, bleached white by the sun, scattered bones around it, and near the base of a desert shrub, a weathered .22 rifle. It was the remains of Simon Amos. Just over 2 kilometers further south, searchers found the second body, James Annetz. His bones were partially intact, many still in place, curled under the limited shade of a gidgee bush. Incredibly, part of the skin around his jawline had not yet decayed. His watch was still on his wrist, still ticking. He had been dead for months, yet somehow time was still moving. Nearby lay a plastic water bottle. On it, scratched into the surface in shaky, faint letters, was a final message. A goodbye. James, my fault. I always love you, Mum and Dad. I found peace. There were no last names, no explanations, just an apology, and the echo of unbearable loneliness. The discovery rocked Australia. The case, once a quiet tragedy contained to the outback, was now a national story. 2 teenage boys, sent alone into the wilderness, left to die slowly, silently, in blistering heat. Their bodies hadn't just been found. They had been left to be found, months too late. And the details only deepened the mystery. James and Simon's Datsun Ute had been located back in December, idling in soft sand, well off the beaten track. The keys were gone. Their wallets were still inside. Some reports suggest the car had been bogged deliberately, as if someone wanted to strand it. But by the time the bodies were found, no clear link between the vehicle and the deaths had ever been made. Then came the medical reports. Simon Amos had died from a gunshot wound to the head, inflicted with the .22 rifle that was found beside him. James Annetz, the coroner ruled, had died of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and exposure, a slow and agonizing death, likely over several days. James had apparently wandered further south before collapsing. He had scratched that message into the bottle with some kind of blade, his last act. But even this quiet heartbreak came with questions. Because the bottle with the message mysteriously vanished. The Annetz family was told about the bottle and its message. James's father, Vincent, would later say that police initially photographed the inscription and showed him the image. But later, when the case was reopened and coronial records reviewed, the bottle was missing from evidence. Gone. No official record of the message remained, aside from Vincent's recollection and a few investigators' notes. They said it was too upsetting, Vincent Annetz would later say. They said it might upset the other family, But that was James's last voice, and they silenced it. It was one more strange disappearance inside an already unspeakable tragedy. And there was something else. When James's belongings were cataloged, his hat was found stained with blood. Not dried sweat, not animal. Blood. Tests were done. According to several sources, the blood did not match James, nor Simon, and no explanation was ever given. The rifle belonged to the station, issued to Simon for bush safety, though neither boy was formally trained to use it. It had one spent casing and was found just meters from Simon's remains. There were no clear fingerprints, no suicide note, just the assumption of self-inflicted death. But if Simon had taken his own life, why hadn't James used the rifle too? Why had he wandered into the desert, alone, dying, and written a message blaming himself? Was it guilt or fear? The coroner ruled Simon's death a suicide, and James's death a result of natural elements. But those closest to the boys never fully accepted it. Too many questions remained. Why did they leave their post and head south? Why didn't they call for help on the radio? Or if they did, why wasn't it recorded? Who was in the four-wheel drive seen tailing them out of Yaga Yaga? What happened to the inscribed water bottle, and whose blood was on James's hat? The desert had yielded the bodies, but not the truth. And for their families, the discovery offered no closure, only more pain and more silence. Chapter 5. The Coroner's Inquest and Public Outcry. After the dust of discovery settled, after the bones were collected, the rifle tagged, and the media turned its eyes to the Kimberley, the next phase of the story began. The inquest. It would become the longest-running coronial inquiry in Western Australia's history. 4 years of transcripts, witness statements, and unanswered questions. But in the end, for many, the conclusions rang hollow. The Western Australian coroner, David McCann, led the inquiry. His task was to examine how James Annetts and Simon Amos, 2 teenage jackaroos, had ended up dead in the heart of the desert, their deaths ruled as exposure and suicide. But that task came with limits. No one was on trial. No charges would be laid. And while the inquest uncovered troubling details, it left many feeling that the truth had been buried deeper than the boys ever were. The official findings were straightforward, at least on paper. Simon Amos, aged 17, died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, likely on or shortly after December 1st, the day of their disappearance. James Annetts, 16, died alone of dehydration, exhaustion, and hyperthermia after wandering for days in the desert heat, with no supplies, no direction, and no way home. The coroner determined that both deaths were not suspicious. But even as those words were spoken in the courtroom, doubt hung heavy in the air. Because what unfolded during those hearings was a story far more disturbing than a simple tale of misadventure. Witness after witness described the same themes. Neglect from the Baines River Cattle Company, incompetent management by station overseers, including Giles Loader, who was repeatedly accused of poor supervision, intimidation, and delaying the missing persons report for nearly 3 critical days, misleading police direction based on Loader's assumption that the boys had gone east, even though locals had seen them heading south, and perhaps most haunting, the complete lack of oversight, placing teenage boys in extreme isolation without regular welfare checks, training, or bush survival knowledge. The coroner noted that James and Simon had been failed. They had been placed in a dangerous environment with no preparation. They had been pushed beyond their emotional limits. And when they disappeared, the systems designed to protect them, from the police to the company itself, moved too slowly, or not at all. Yet, no one was held accountable. There were no criminal charges, no negligence lawsuits, No prosecution of those who hired, managed, or left them alone. Instead, the blame was placed, gently, on the desert and on the boys' lack of experience, as though the land itself had devoured them. But their families knew better. At the inquest, Vincent Annetz, James's father, spoke with restraint, but he did not hide his heartbreak. He described his son as gentle, loyal, deeply religious, a boy who had never even been away from home alone before taking the job. He was not the kind of person, Vincent said, who would abandon his post or run off into the bush without reason. James wouldn't have walked away unless he was forced to, he said. And even then, he would have tried to do the right thing. That's the kind of boy he was. The Amos family, too, voiced their frustrations, quietly but pointedly. Simon had been unhappy at the station. He had written letters home expressing loneliness, unease, even fear. And yet, he had stayed. He was trying to make it work. Neither boy wanted to die out there. The public responded with outrage. In towns across Australia, people asked how it was possible, in a supposedly developed modern nation, for two underage boys to be left in total isolation in the outback with no oversight, no backup, and no emergency plan. Newspapers called it a national shame. Editorials demanded reform of pastoral industry practices. Investigative reports exposed how young workers were being hired as cheap labor, sent into remote regions with little more than a radio and a rifle, expected to manage grueling workloads without supervision. A report by the New South Wales Child Welfare Department noted that the arrangement was grossly irresponsible and called for urgent changes to how young rural workers were trained, monitored, and supported. But no sweeping reforms came. Over time, as the headlines faded and the cameras moved on, the story of James and Simon, like so many tragedies that unfold far from the cities, began to slip from the national conversation. The coroner's findings closed the official chapter. But for those who loved the boys, it was not justice. It was a declaration that something had gone terribly wrong, but that no one would answer for it. And that, perhaps, was the final failure. Because James and Simon didn't just die in the desert. They were left there by a system that forgot them. Chapter 6. Theories and Unanswered Questions. The Outback keeps its secrets. 4 decades have passed since James Annetz and Simon Amos vanished into the desert. And while the coroner closed the case with a tidy conclusion, death by suicide and exposure, the public, the families, and even former station workers have never truly believed the full story was told. Because too much doesn't add up. Too many details resist neat explanation. Too many moments feel less like coincidence and more like warning signs ignored. And so, the case endures, not just as a tragedy, but as a mystery. The voluntary death theory. The official version of events goes something like this. On December 1st, 1986, Simon and James, disillusioned and exhausted, chose to abandon their remote posts. They drove south into the desert and got their ute stuck in the sand. Isolated, dehydrated, and emotionally overwhelmed, Simon used the .22 rifle to take his own life. James, unwilling to do the same, wandered for days before finally collapsing. He wrote a farewell message to his parents, apologizing and asking for peace. It's a heartbreaking story, but is it true? There's no denying the boys were emotionally fragile, under immense stress, and utterly unprepared for the harshness of the Kimberley. But those who knew them say neither was suicidal. Neither had histories of depression or self-harm. Both came from deeply religious families. And more importantly, why did Simon kill himself almost immediately, and James didn't? Why didn't they radio for help before leaving the station? Why did they drive away from their assigned posts and deeper into the desert? And if the boys simply panicked, who was the four-wheel drive that followed them out of Yaga Yaga? The foul play theory. This is the theory most feared by the families and least explored by authorities. It starts with the indigenous eyewitness accounts. Several residents of the Yaga Yaga community reported seeing a four-wheel drive tailing the boys as they passed through, looking nervous and glancing over their shoulders. These witnesses said it was not a station vehicle and that it stayed close behind. That four-wheel drive was never identified. Police dismissed the sighting. But if someone had followed them, out of anger, out of threat, out of power, what happened next? Some believe the boys may have fled, either coerced or chased. Others suggest Simon may have been shot, and the suicide ruling was convenient, not accurate. The rifle had no conclusive prints, the trajectory wasn't clear, and if Simon truly shot himself, why did he do it while James was still with him, leaving his friend alone in a vast wasteland? Even more chilling are the rumors of violence and intimidation at Flora Valley Station. Multiple jackaroos described verbal abuse, physical threats, and unsafe working conditions under station manager Giles Loader. Was something being covered up? We may never know. The unknown third-party theory. Then there's the blood-stained hat. James's hat, found near his remains, tested positive for blood that belonged to neither boy. The report was quietly buried in the inquest. There was no follow-up, no retesting, no sample preserved for future analysis. How did unknown blood end up on James's personal item? If Simon died from a self-inflicted wound and James died alone, whose blood was it? This small, forgotten detail may be the most critical clue in the entire case, pointing to a presence never recorded, never acknowledged. The missing water bottle. And then there's the water bottle. James's final message, scratched into the surface with what little strength he had left, was a heartbreak carved into plastic. James, my fault. I always love you, Mom and Dad. I found peace. But that bottle was never entered into evidence. It vanished, either destroyed, misplaced, or deliberately hidden. The original photo shown to his father is gone, and without it, James's last words exist only through hearsay and memory. For many, this isn't just an oversight. It's a symbolic erasure of the human heart of the case, a quiet silencing of what might have been the only direct clue to what the boys were thinking, fearing, or experiencing in those final moments. The questions swirl even now. Why did it take 3 days to report the boys missing? Why were the local indigenous reports ignored? Why did the company hire underage, untrained boys and send them alone into the bush? Why has no one ever been held accountable? And the most haunting question of all, did James and Simon truly walk into the desert to die? Or were they running from something or someone far worse? Theories remain, but evidence is scarce. The desert, as always, has the memory. What we are left with is silence, and 2 young lives, full of promise, taken by a system that failed at every level to protect them. The Flora Valley mystery is not just a story of isolation and death. It is a story of neglect, dismissal, and the profound cost of not listening. To those in pain, to those in danger, to those who saw. Chapter 7. Legacy and What Remains. The desert is a place of silence, and sometimes silence becomes a grave. But what happened to James Annetts and Simon Amos in 1986 didn't disappear with the wind. It lingered, in memory, in law, and in the hearts of 2 families who never stopped grieving. Because their deaths were not inevitable. They were not an act of nature. They were a consequence of decisions made by adults in charge, of systems that failed, of voices that were ignored until it was too late. And so, long after the bones were buried, the story continued. For Vincent and Netz, James's father, the loss was devastating, not just because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No one from the Baines River Cattle Company ever apologized. No one was fired. No new safety standards were imposed. No inquest recommendation was enforced. "They buried our boys," he once said, but they never buried their own guilt. Vincent spent years fighting to keep his son's name, and Simon's, in the public eye. He wrote letters to newspapers, gave interviews to regional stations, and pushed for reforms to rural employment standards. But much of that momentum faded by the early 1990s. In many ways, it was like the desert had swallowed the outrage too. Yet their story did spark change, even if quietly. In the years after the inquest, pastoral companies across Australia began facing tougher questions about their treatment of young workers. Teenage jackaroo placements were scrutinized more closely. Some states tightened their regulations on remote employment, training protocols, and emergency planning. But none of those changes bore the boys' names. There is no national law dedicated to their memory, no formal policy change attributed directly to their deaths. Just the story. A story whispered across red dust and bitter heat. A warning, unspoken, between workers at distant stations, and a lingering sense that what happened once could happen again. Today, in Griffith, New South Wales, and in Adelaide, the names James Netz and Simon Amos still live on, not in headlines, but in memories. They were just boys. James, 16, was devout and soft-spoken. He loved music. He wrote poems. He was the kind of teenager who sent letters home every week, never missed a call. Simon, 17, was bolder, a little older, a little more restless. But he too was looking for something simple: adventure, independence, purpose. Neither of them was meant to die in the bush. Neither of them should have been alone. And neither of them has been forgotten, not by those who still say their names. In 2018, a memorial stone was quietly erected in Halls Creek, close to the region where they vanished. It bears only a few words: "In memory of James Netz and Simon Amos. May their story never be repeated." But in truth, their story was never just about two boys. It was about the fragility of human life when placed in indifferent hands. It was about how neglect can look like policy, and how injustice can wear a uniform of procedure. It was about what happens when we send our young into the unknown and don't go with them. There will likely never be charges, no final revelations, no stranger found guilty in some distant town. But the Flora Valley mystery remains, because mysteries aren't always about what we don't know. Sometimes they're about what we chose not to see. And in this case, what we didn't see, what we refused to act on, cost 2 lives. So tonight, remember James and Simon, not just for how they died, but for who they were and how they were failed. And if you ever find yourself driving across the Australian outback, past Yaga Yaga, past Flora Valley, beneath the endless sky, look out at that red horizon and listen to the silence. Because in that silence, if you listen hard enough, you just might hear a voice. "James, my fault. I always love you, Mom and Dad. I found peace." Thank you for joining us for this episode. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime mysteries and untold Australian stories. And above all, never forget their names. James Netz, Simon Amos. They were just boys. And thanks for listening, and let me know your thoughts below.